Big question for me was, if I take away the house, if I take away the money, the business, the car that I drive, the clothes that I wear, who am I? And that was a big question for me, and I didn't have an answer at that time. Just to start briefly, as Robin explained, I always try and get my story down. It's a 28-year story down to 1 minute. But essentially, I stood up there a couple of weeks ago and shared that 10 years ago my dad took his life, and it was a very sudden suicide in the fact that I always say he had everything on paper. And for me, that was a really big wake-up call that suicide, we never think it will affect us, but it can affect any one of us here. And I buried it, I buried it like a true man, a true 18-year-old would. I went to a nightclub 6 days after. I drank, nearly every night that I could, and I started a fashion business, which was great looking back at it, but also it was a huge distraction. I just immersed myself into work, trying to chase success, and a couple of years later, all that grief crept up, and I was at a really low point as well. And as David kind of mentioned earlier, for me what really helped was just being open and talking, and it took a couple of people to get there. But the day that I did open up and I said, my dad took his life, I don't know how to deal with it, I cried, I showed emotion, was the first step to actually being able to deal with that grief. And I just think it's so important that as men we don't judge ourselves for being open, for being honest, for talking about how we feel. And the suicide rates amongst men are scary. So we definitely need to be more open about how we feel and not judge ourselves for being so. So for me it was hard because I didn't want to, me and my mum are very close, but I didn't want to tell her because she was dealing with the fact she just lost her husband. I didn't want to tell my brother, my friends, the way we dealt with it was just getting drunk on a Friday night and a Saturday night. I'm from Essex, that's what we do. But yeah, for me, I went to the counsellor, it didn't really work, it was too forced for me. And I tried another psychologist, it didn't really help. The lady who helped me massively, she was essentially a holistic therapist. I would never ever imagine opening up to her. But essentially what she was very compassionate. She understood, she'd been there before, and we were touching on it earlier, how when someone is vulnerable, when someone is compassionate, it allows it to be more of a safer space for us to talk. And I find when I do talks, whether it's in companies or at events, I share my story very open and honest, and men always come up and share their story too. So I think it's definitely being okay with vulnerability and being compassionate definitely helps as well.
And it can start with a very simple question, can't it? How are you?
Exactly.
It's a question that we have to rebut quite regularly.
But how are you always leads to I'm fine, right? So it's again, asking twice, how are you really? I've noticed that you didn't come out the last couple of times, is everything okay at home? I'm fine doesn't really mean a lot. It's a tough question because mental health is so individual, but for me, as David kind of mentioned, it's just like a switch and you can feel it coming on, and again, everyone's so different. For noticing it in other people, I always say it's behaviour changes. So my dad changed very quickly overnight. My dad went from an engineer, a runner, someone who was just happy, to just overnight depressed. Saying things like, where the money was. My dad went from being my dad to attempting suicide a week later. It was very, very quick. But another behaviour change that I realised recently is my dad actually, after his first attempt, spent a bit of time in a mental health unit, and that was my first real exposure to mental illness. And he also had another behaviour change where he went from being very depressed to all of a sudden, I want to go home to my family, I feel better now. And it's just, if we know the person, we can see those behaviour changes differently. Again, that was his way of saying, I need to get out of this mental health unit to take my life. And it's being able to understand those behaviour changes, I think, is very, very key. And I always talk a lot about self-awareness. Like I know when I'm starting to feel depressed. And I also now have self-awareness to know maybe why I am and how I can maybe get out of that dark hole as well. So yeah, definitely self-awareness for yourself and then noticing behaviour changes in other people. Yeah, so David hit the nail on the head in the fact of it is a very fake environment. And my background was the menswear industry. I used to put a photo of me wearing a suit and say, rate this out of 10, but really I was feeling extremely depressed wearing a tracksuit, and it just had no reflection of what I was, social media is just fake. It's as simple as that. And one thing that I'm trying to do, and Darren's sitting in the front there, is I've just launched a new podcast series called Behind the Real. And essentially I've interviewed a YouTuber he's got 5 million subscribers. I've just interviewed a couple that travel and their feed looks like they're extremely happy and they live a glorious life. But sitting down with them for an hour, and Darren was very open about his depression, and these guys spoke about how they argue a lot and they have fallen out with their family since they've been doing this travel Instagram account, but their feed just doesn't reflect that. So I think for me, I'm using social media now more of a way of raising awareness and trying to reach more people, talking more positively and showing more authenticity. But I definitely think, it's a very negative environment if we do compare ourselves to that highlight reel. And it's just trying to understand maybe that the people behind those feeds are real people. They all do struggle, and trying to break down that barrier. Yeah, for me, it's been a complete gradual process. So I'm 28 now, but I lost my dad at 18, so that was a big turning point. But then I always say we have these life-defining moments, and then we just go back into reality. It wakes you up with life, and then you just find yourself going back to routine. Even though I look 16, I'm a father as well now, and a husband, and all of those kind of defining moments have changed me. And as well, I don't really talk very openly about it, but my brother had a traumatic brain injury nearly 2 years ago. Just shortly after my wedding, he was my best man. We came home and he had still fall from a hoist, and he's brain damaged and spent a year in hospital. And that was the moment that I transitioned from the fashion industry to talking more about mental health, because it was, it's very cliche to say that life can change in a heartbeat, but it can. And for me, it's just been a complete gradual process, and nothing's overnight. There's no quick fix, there's no short-term pill or diet, as David said, that anyone can take that's going to get there. It's completely gradual. Good question. Meditation's helped me in the past. I don't necessarily practice meditation now. My dad meditated. I remember walking past, my dad was a physio as well, he had a physiotherapy practice at home. I remember walking past once and there was wow music playing in the room, and I was thinking, what is Dad doing in there? And he was meditating. And but for me, there's a lot of misconceptions around meditation and mindfulness, and I feel like now I am more calmer, so I don't necessarily need to practice it. But 100%, I think people should all try it. But again, I think it's finding what works for you. A lot of people don't like meditation, a lot of people don't like mindfulness. It makes them feel worse, or they just can't seem to get on with it. But I think for everyone, it's just experimenting with as many things that we can, and kind of see what works for us and what helps our mental health.